And we now come on to statement from Secretary of State for Education, Gillian Keegan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and with your permission I would like to make a statement to the House setting out the Government's proposals for updating the 2019 Statutory Guidance on Relationships, Sex and Health Education, which my department has published today for consultation, and I would like to thank them for their hard work in getting us to this point. This Government has a plan to deliver a brighter future for Britain, one where families are supported and given the peace of mind that their children are safe and being equipped with the skills they need to succeed. Good relationships, sex and health education, RSHE as it's known, plays a key role in this. However, following disturbing reports from parents of pupils being taught inappropriate content in schools and requests from schools who wanted more clarity on when to teach certain topics, the Prime Minister and I decided to bring forward the review into RSHE. We have listened to colleagues across government and the House, we've gathered evidence from stakeholders and considered advice from an independent expert panel who generously gave their time, experience and knowledge to support the review last year, and I would like to put on record my personal thanks to each individual panel member. We need to make sure that the content of lessons is factual, appropriate, and that children have the capacity to fully understand everything they are being taught. We need to make sure our children are prepared for the world in which they live, but not in a way that takes away the innocence of childhood. In short, we need to allow our children to be children. It's a fine line to tread, and the schools need clarity on how to approach it. Overall, this guidance is underpinned by three core values. 1. Parents have a right to know what their children are being taught. 2. Teachers are there to teach children facts, not push the agendas of campaign groups. 3. Schools should not teach about the contested issue of gender identity, including that gender is a spectrum. There are 5 major policy changes that I would like to set out. Firstly, the introduction of age limits for teaching sensitive subjects. The purpose of the new age limits is to make sure children are not taught things before they are ready to understand them. Informed by the advice of the independent panel and others, the guidance places specific age limits on the teaching of certain subjects. In primary schools, children learn about the importance of boundaries, privacy, and that they have rights over their own bodies. But no 10-year-old should be taught about the details of intimate sexual acts, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. In primary schools, sex education is not a requirement and should only be introduced from Year 5 onwards. The content should align with the national curriculum's science teachings on conception and birth, ensuring it is rooted in fact. It should absolutely not be preparing primary-age children for sexual activity. The second flagship change is complete openness with parents. Parents are children's first teachers, and they must know what they are being taught. The guidance contains a new section that makes the need for transparency with parents crystal clear and clarifies the scope within the law to share materials. The bottom line is that curriculum providers should not be seeking to hide their materials from parents. This practice is completely unacceptable. Parents have a fundamental right to know what their children are being taught about healthy relationships, sex and development. Thirdly, on teaching about gender reassignment, many schools have told us that they need clear guidance to help them teach about this highly sensitive, complex issue in a factual and safe way. We are making it absolutely clear that the contested topic of gender identity should not be taught in schools at any age. Schools should not be providing classroom materials that, for example, include the view that gender is a spectrum. Whilst protected characteristics such as gender reassignment should be taught, they must be done so on a factual basis at an appropriate age and not based on contested ideology. This reflects the cautious common sense approach that we have taken in our guidance on children questioning their gender, and which also reflects the recommendations of the CAS review. There is also a dedicated section on sexual harassment and sexual violence. The growth of malign influencers online that pose a risk to children and young people has been significant, and one of the key ways the world has changed for young people since this guidance was originally published, and indeed since all of us were in school. This new section covers some specific types of abusive behaviour which were not previously discussed, such as stalking, as well as advice for teachers about how to address dangerous, misogynistic online influences. Now, I'd like to consider the sensitive but important issue of suicide prevention. Ministers and I have met bereaved families, experts and teachers to explore how suicide prevention could be taught as part of RSHE. And I want to pay tribute to the incredible work of the Three Dads Walk-In, who have used their unimaginable tragedies in their lives to campaign for important change. The current RSHE guidance already included content in relation to teaching pupils to look after their mental well-being and support themselves and their friends. And we've now made clearer how this content on mental well-being relates to suicide prevention. Of course, the topic of suicide itself needs to be handled sensitively and skillfully, and not before pupils are ready to understand it. Obviously, children's maturity varies, but our engagement suggested that typically children develop the necessary understanding from when they are in Year 8. We have made sure this updated guidance acknowledges that it can be important to discuss this with pupils, and we have added advice to set out how schools could address suicide prevention in their teaching. Finally, the guidance also includes a new topic on personal safety. This includes additional content on understanding the laws around carrying knives and knife crime, and the dangers of fire, roads, railways and water. Together, I am confident that this guidance will give teachers and head teachers clarity over what should and should not be taught. It will provide parents with the peace of mind that their children are being taught in a safe and factual manner, and it will reassure everyone across society that pupils are being taught what they need to know at the right age and time in their lives. A copy of the guidance has been deposited in the libraries of both houses, and I commend this statement to the House.
Front bench, Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I also thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. Labour's approach starts from the belief that education should prepare our children for the world in which they live and the future that they, together, will shape. And to achieve that, to give each and every child the opportunity and the future that they deserve, relationships, sex and health education must be an integral part of every child's education. The content of such education must be both age-appropriate and taught in a respectful manner and tailored to the reality of children's lives. The Secretary of State has set out today that the Government intend to achieve this through the introduction of age limits on certain aspects of this curriculum. Today's statement has been long in the making. Alongside school leaders, we've consistently pushed for clearer guidance on these issues to be introduced so school leaders and teachers can feel confident and supported in what they are teaching. And while we're pleased that the guidance is at last being published, there is deep concern about the lack of consultation with school leaders in developing the guidance so far. If the Government is serious about ensuring that RSHE is taught in a dignified and respectful manner and in a way that school teachers and school leaders feel that they can confidently deliver, then they must ensure that the voices of school leaders and teachers are heard. So I want to ask the Secretary of State if she's able to address a couple of concerns in particular. The first is a concern that arises from the reality that education is one of our strongest levers for preventing child abuse. It is crucial at a time of rising levels of sexual offences against children, especially our youngest children, that children are empowered to recognise when something isn't right. The Secretary of State will know that sometimes such issues arise urgently in a class or in a wider school community outside of the timeline that a teacher might have in mind, perhaps even before the age limits that she is proposing. So will she say something about the ability of teachers to respond to and reflect such concerns in future in the context of age limits, and especially when they arise among younger children? The second concern is about the importance of children learning not just about their own relationships tomorrow, but their own and other people's families today. And on this side of the House, we believe that what matters about families is not the shape they have, but the love they give. Teaching children about the facts of the world in which they grow up must include an understanding that there are people who are transgender, that people can go through a process of change of their gender, and that the law provides for that. The Secretary of State outlined a little of her thinking in her statement and on Radio 4 this morning, but I wondered if she could set it out in more detail for the House today. On some of the other issues raised by this guidance, Labour very much welcome the intention of the guidance to remove the barriers that some parents face when asking what is being taught to their children. Of course, parents should know what their children are being taught. And while they're already required to do so, it is acknowledged that there have been issues with interpretations of copyright legislation, and it's absolutely right that ministers seek to clarify this issue. We also welcome that there will be additional content on suicide prevention in the secondary curriculum, as well as covering the risks of self-harm and suicide content on social media. However, it does need to be backed up with support in schools to adequately address the challenges that far too many children and young people face with their mental health. Labour has a funded plan to ensure every young person will have access to a specialist mental health professional at secondary school and for mental health hubs in every community. And whilst we await the next Labour government, this government must urgently set out how it will get these CAMHS waiting lists down and deliver support to children and young people who need it most. We also welcome the inclusion of content on sexual harassment and sexual violence. Yesterday, I joined the leader of Redbridge Council and teachers to hear about the innovative STEP in programme that they're delivering in schools, tackling sexual harassment, sexist harassment and misogyny. It was really inspiring to see the students so confidently addressing the issues with their peers in changing attitudes, and I hope that as part of the review, the government will look at some of the fantastic resources that local authorities have developed while waiting for the government to act. We will now need to look at the exact detail of the draft guidance, and schools will too. And it's really important that stakeholders from across education are able to feedback their views, and I hope that the government will reflect on them when finalising this guidance and listen to the voices of schools, parents and young people in doing so.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. So I'd like to address the Honourable Lady's points. I think I've made a note of all of them. First of all, that it was long in the making, just so we are all aware of the timeline. This guidance was issued in 2019. It was made statutory in 2020. Ofsted conducted some work to see how it was bedding in. That gave us some feedback and some comment that there was more clarity needed. That was in the second half of 2021. And obviously we have taken leadership on this issue, leadership that I think actually the Labour-run Wales could probably take a leaf out of our book on. But we've taken leadership on this issue. We've worked with a broad number of organisations. Obviously I mentioned the independent expert panel, but we've also worked with 86 other organisations as well. And of course, this step today is out for consultation. So we do expect that everybody who has a view, whether it's parents or teachers or everybody, local authorities, can fully engage with that consultation. In terms of the question about if an urgent issue comes up or a child wants to ask questions or deal with something specifically that they've seen or that occurs for them, of course we expect that they can always ask questions. We build safe and trusting environments in our schools, and there's a difference between a pupil asking a teacher a question or trying to discuss something with a teacher and a teacher standing up in front of a whole class and teaching on a particular subject. In terms of the question about knowing about transgender and that gender reassignment exists, and there's a law that provides for it, it's a protected characteristic, it's something that adults can do when they're older, and to understand that fact, of course, we have made clear that that is the case. And in terms of mental health support teams, I don't know, the Labour Party seem to have missed what we've been doing on mental health. So in every school in our country, we have trained or given a grant to train a mental health support leader, and most of that work has been done. Our schools have been engaged with that for a long time. And also 4.2 million pupils, which is up from 3.4 million pupils last year, now have access to the mental health support teams that we're rolling out in all of our schools. Rather different from the Labour policy, we don't have to completely raid any other sector that's supporting SEND or private schools to do that. We're doing that also for primary and secondary because we think that's very important. And the Honourable Lady mentioned materials, and I just wanted to also update the House that oak materials will be available in our SHE and they'll be available in the autumn.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I join in thanking the Secretary of State for putting forward proposals which children need and which teachers, parents and school leaders have wanted. It seems to me that a lot of people are now saying, of course, what she's doing is right, when a year or two ago they weren't. And I just say in passing, there are some people who have been providing sex education lessons and gender lessons in primary schools who boast they've presented to 100,000 children, they've trained over 4,000 staff, and that kind of infiltration, I think, has to end. Can I also say to the Secretary of State that I hope that her Permanent Secretary and others are listening to their SEEN networks, Sex Equality and Equity networks, who raise to their department, or try to, when departments ask questions about gender, then they should be asking questions about sex.
Well, I thank the Father of the House, and as usual, he shows true leadership in this area as in many others. He's absolutely quite right. There are examples of organisations who themselves on their website with a material that we think is inappropriate, is teaching contested views as facts, also boast in how many schools that they have worked with. Some organisations who, I won't name them, but they've been teaching children about gender expression, gender roles, different kinds of gender identities, and they claim to have worked with over 500 schools, and there's many examples of this, which is why we did have to show leadership on this. And I think it's important because we have shown leadership in the area of gender questioning. We have been very clear between biological sex and how to teach this in schools. And it is an important thing because in Labour-run Wales, they've removed, I believe, all reference to man and women in their curriculum, and they recommend that teaching that sex is not just about male or female. Now, I don't know whether I want to look if these reports are true, but I'd be very happy to offer to support the Welsh Education Minister with this, because it really does need to be taken seriously, and people have very much changed their views on this.
Lilian Greenwood.
Sorry. Mr Deputy Speaker. The Children's Commissioner has found that exposure to pornography is affecting children as young as 8. I'm sure none of us would want that to be the case, but of course we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. How will the Secretary of State support schools to manage pupils' reactions to what they're seeing online? And we know that they are being exposed to things online that we wish they weren't, if those issues can't be addressed in RSHE.
Also, part of leadership and sharing leadership is also dealing with those things that we're not happy with. So we're not happy that young children are seeing access to porn, which is why we are also putting in place other measures through the Department for Science and DCIT. So we're also putting those measures in place as well. But of course, it is always possible that children may see access to things that they shouldn't and may raise questions as a result of that. Now, usually parents are the first educators of their children, and parents would be the first people to get that question, and parents would certainly expect to be, to help their child through those things. But also, as I said before, if a child raises that question to a teacher, then of course a teacher will deal with that. But that's different from teaching and showing anything that's sexually explicit in a classroom. And what we want to do is make sure that children are not exposed to that in the first place, because that is something that's changed, and it's something where we need to show leadership to address that.
So, Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In answer to a question on 29th of April, the Schools Minister, my right honourable friend for East Hampshire, strongly endorsed the importance of sections 406 and 407 of the 1996 Education Act, which respectively ban the promotion of partisan political views and require the balanced presentation of opposing views when politically contentious subjects are brought to the attention of pupils. Gender ideology is certainly politically contentious, and I was concerned to be alerted by the educational commentator and campaigner Mrs Claire Page to the DFE's Political Impartiality in Schools Guidance 2022, which states, legal duties on political impartiality do not supersede schools' other statutory requirements, schools should take a reasonable and proportionate approach to ensuring political impartiality alongside their other responsibilities. I don't know how you would read that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I read it as an attempt to undermine the firm guidance given in statute law that you must not promote partisan political views in school, and I hope the Secretary of State will look into this matter.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, for raising this point. So, of course, political impartiality is very important, and that the quotes that you read out in the political impartiality guidance is meant to cover some common sense exceptions. For example, some people who would argue against democracy, we don't want to give those a platform. Some people who would argue for racism, we don't want to give them a platform, etc. So that's this sort of exceptions contentions, and I will make sure that we look at that to see that that is clearly understood by everybody, because it is important to be clear. This is an issue that has developed and grown. Probably over time our understanding has grown in this area, but that is what it is meant to do, not to undermine political impartiality or the rule of law.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In reviewing the 2019 guidance, does the Secretary of State share my concern that not quite enough is being done on child safeguarding when it comes to child sexual exploitation, and in particular awareness raising so that children and parents understand the warning signs that are there? Across many towns, a play called Somebody's Sister, Somebody's Daughter was rolled out except to secondary school age children, but nevertheless that led to 150 disclosures of concerns by children about family members, other pupils at the school, where they were seeing the patterns of grooming potentially at play. Does she accept that, however we would want the world to be, 43% of Year 3 children, so 7 and 8 year olds, have access to a smartphone? You know, if we do not teach this in school, they will find information out through other routes that will not be helpful at all for the safeguarding of children.
There is another approach, which is obviously looking at access to smartphones at a very young age. But in terms of what the Honourable Gentleman mentions, the guidance that is most appropriate for that is the Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is a very substantial piece of guidance. It's used very regularly by schools, and it also is regularly reviewed as well. But of course, there is a live discussion about the concerns that we have of children having access to harmful contents through mobile phones at a young age, and that is something that we will continue to consider, and is in fact why I did take the step to also ban the use of smartphones in schools as well.
Sir John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, the poet John Betjeman said that childhood is measured out in sounds, smells and sights before the dark hour of reason grows. Darkness falls when very young children are forced to know too much too early, and their innocence is stolen. So, in warmly welcoming the government's approach, will the Secretary of State look again at the third-party organisations often invited into schools, sometimes witlessly, sometimes carelessly, for they steal children's innocence in the name very often of diversity and inclusion, and in so doing promote, promulgate and perpetuate every kind of horror?
Well, of course, not only will I be able to look at the documents now, but the materials, but so will parents, and of course so will Ofsted when they do the reviews of what is happening in schools against the guidance that we have issued. So the transparency is very important, and it does mean that obviously we should make sure that the materials are appropriate, the guidance is there as well, but I do believe that transparency will act as a great guide to make sure that the right materials are in our schools.
Sir George Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State and I grew up in the same part of the world, a few hundred yards away from each other, albeit at different times. And in my time, there was no way in which you could have a discussion with your parents, who didn't feel it was appropriate at all to discuss these issues. It certainly was never discussed in my school. I'm sure even in her later time it wasn't discussed. The most I can remember is being shown a film by a PE teacher, Second World War film about sexually transmitted diseases, which frankly terrified me. But I'm sure the Secretary of State will agree with me that it is now timely that teachers get the guidance they need so they can have sensible conversations with young people, and for that matter parents as well. But will she agree with me that we need to have this conversation respectfully? We need to have this conversation not to create dividing lines, but to create common ground. And in that respect, will she urge some of her colleagues in the government to stop using it to create dividing lines?
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that obviously in Nosey, a couple of years apart, the sex education didn't change an awful lot. We had 2 lessons, one where the girls and boys were apart, and one where they were together, where we were shown a film about childbirth, and I think part of the class actually collapsed at that point and a couple fainted, and that was it. So I think the times have moved on a lot, and in fact, even education in Nosey's moved on a lot. I'm delighted we now have some good schools, as we now have 90% of our schools are good or outstanding. That includes Nosey as well, which I'm sure both him and I are delighted about. It is important to show leadership on these issues, but it is also important to do so respectfully. That is something I've always sought to do, to answer and respond to a problem. And this is a problem that's been raised by parents. It's some concerns that have been raised by teachers as well, requesting more clarity. And I've tried to do and respond to that, both with the gender questioning guidance and also with this guidance as well. But it is important that we respectfully discuss these matters.
Nick Fletcher.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, today is a very good day. From what I've read, from what I've heard the Secretary of State say at the dispatch box, this is what we have been waiting for. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State and the Minister, the Schools Minister, sat to the side at the moment, for listening to me and to many other colleagues. Some of those debates have been extremely heated, but I've felt so passionately about this, and so has my colleague, the member from Penistone and Stocksbridge, and the member from Canterbury on the other side of this House. It is a very good day. I will be studying this guidance over the weekend, and I hope we can probably have further meetings about this over the coming weeks. Parents do not want their children being taught by Stonewall and Brooke. They do not want them teaching about an ideology not based in anything. They need teaching the facts by all accounts, but they have to be facts of truth. This is where we need to be with this. The age appropriateness is also extremely important, and I welcome that too. Children are children and should be kept as children as long as possible. It's a precious time. We all wish we could go back there. We do not want to be putting our children into adulthood far too soon. So I do welcome this. I have 3 issues that I would just like to very quickly raise, if that's okay. There is literature that is within the school system that we need to make sure is removed. There is an awful lot. One of the biggest problems we've had is the denial of this literature being in these schools. It is in these schools, it's online, it's in paper, it's all over the place. It needs to come out. Very quickly, we need to enforce this once it's done, because we've got schools who still don't want to enforce this. And finally, I still believe we do need a public inquiry into how we got to this point, and we put 9,000 children on a health path which is damaging. So we need to address that. It's very good news. I welcome it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to thank all members of the House who have discussed this respectfully, but also contributed to our understanding on this as well, and obviously developed our understanding of what's going on in schools. In terms of what's there in schools, and I welcome my honourable friends' welcome of this guidance as well. Obviously, materials now will have to be shown to parents, and no ifs, no buts. We've made that crystal clear. And of course, the materials will need to be in line with the guidance. In terms of enforcement, Ofsted will also, as part of what they usually do, go round and review, look at schools, and they will also look at this guidance and what's being taught against this guidance, and they will, so there is an enforcement process as well. And of course, you know, it hasn't been easy to put this guidance together, and I'd like to thank all of the members of the teams and members of the House who've helped us in this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, although I do feel he's quite a bit overdue. Will the Secretary of State concede that this debacle originated, at least in part, from the World Health Organisation's international guidance for sexuality education? And it's happening across the world, not just in this country. It's led to a deeply damaging situation where unscientific gender ideology has been pushed to our children in our schools. Will the Secretary of State explain to the House how many children she believes have been exposed to this abuse, and what steps the Secretary of State is going to take to correct the mistakes that have already been made, and what assurance to parents that nothing like this can ever happen again and it's stopped today?
Well, obviously I take responsibility for England, and as I say, I welcome the Honourable Gentleman's welcoming of this, but I think we have shown leadership. We have issued gender questioning guidance. December last year, we've issued the update of the relationship, sex, health, education guidance. I think we've even shown within the United Kingdom there's been different views on this, and I reiterate my offer to both Wales and Scotland if they want to work with us, because it has been an emerging evidence on this. But you know, I can only show leadership in the areas for which I'm responsible.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome this. It goes further than I thought the guidance, and it's also unambiguous. This isn't about creating dividing lines. I was quite late to this debate until I realised it was an actual issue. I came up with some evidence of some worrying practices going on, and then I became involved in the issue. It's so important that this statutory guidance has teeth. And if even after this unambiguous guidance there are repeated breaches of it by a particular school, what mechanism is in place to hold that school to account? And also transparency. Parents need to know what their children are being taught. And again on this, if there are examples of schools, even with this guidance being evasive, what powers are in the hands of parents to ensure that they can find out the facts?
Well, the guidance is very clear, and it's actually quite unusual to have guidance where it's largely aimed at schools, but there are some parts which are there for parents as well, and we will put on the Education Hub some more communication for parents as well, so they know what their rights are as a result of this guidance. But it is very important and very clear. And actually, you know, you always think when you're taking these positions, what does the counterfactual look like? It really is ridiculous to suggest that parents should not see materials that their children are being taught about in school. It really is. In terms of enforcement, as I mentioned, this will become part of the usual school enforcement, and Ofsted will look at this guidance, look at what's happening in schools, and they will use that as part of their Ofsted's inspections.
Tonya Antonietta.
Mr Deputy Speaker, now 7 years ago, before I came into this House, I spent 20 years teaching, some in the northwest of England, some in Wales. And I know, as a modern foreign languages teacher, that RSE was something I had to deliver. Now, the majority of teachers have to deliver RSE are not trained, and this still concerns me. And therefore, I saw first-hand, Secretary of State, how lobby groups have easily been able to permeate this area in both England and in Wales. So while this is welcome, it's also very late. And I do appreciate the comments that she's made about the devolved nations. And this is why it is important. We must take the politics out of this debate. We must present facts, and we must work together. So would she share with the expert panel findings with the new Education Minister in Wales and have a grown-up conversation, and let's take the politics out of this, because these are people's lives.
Absolutely, and hopefully the Honourable Lady will have seen that that's just not my style. I try to see problems, fix them, and do them in a reasonable and respectful way. Quality materials are important because the Honourable Lady may have had that training, but as she says, not every child and not every teacher will have that training. So the quality of materials is absolutely vital, and it is clear, as we've heard from others, that there has been some poor quality materials and some materials that were spouting nonsense, actually, let's be honest. That's why we will be producing our own materials, which the Oak National Academy will be producing in the autumn. And I would very much welcome a meeting with the Education Ministry in Wales, who, as you say, is new and may not yet looked at this in detail, but to remove references to man and woman in the curriculum, that sounds ridiculous, and recommending that teaching sex is not just male or female, again, sounds ridiculous. Maybe some of those materials have made their way into the curriculum, and I would welcome working with any of the devolved nations to get them out of our schools.
So Desmond Swain.
The statement has been so necessary today is a measure of a fact that members of the teaching profession, some members of the teaching profession, have taken leave of their senses. And in that light, will she consider to what extent the remedy is guidance or statutory requirement?
Well, it is statutory guidance, and therefore, and it is also, I think, going to be very transparent that the materials are now available to parents. So it's not only statutory guidance, but it is under the scrutiny of every parent in the school as well. But I think it's clear that what we need to do is to support our teachers and head teachers to make sure they get this right. The vast majority will be getting it right. The vast majority of teachers and head teachers will be getting it right. But of course, it is an issue, an area that not everybody is specifically trained to teach. So I think it is important that we provide the materials, we provide the guidance, and we make sure Ofsted also enforce it.
Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In 2023, over 400 young people were diagnosed with a sexually transmitted infection every day. Earlier this year, the Women and Equalities Committee found, and I quote, compelling evidence that relationships and sex education in schools is inadequate, including in relation to contraception and STIs, and the Children's Commissioner has similarly attributed the shocking increase to the fact that we're not actually teaching our kids what they need to hear. So could the Secretary of State explain to the House how she thinks this new guidance, which seems to suggest that STIs won't be taught about before year 9, so age 13, 14, how will this new guidance address these shocking rates?
The new guidance will also be supplemented with materials that will be available from Oak National Academy, which will make sure will address any of the concerns that have raised, and I look forward to working with the Children Commissioner and others to make sure that it does.
Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the focus on tackling misogyny online and the influences that peddle that. I do worry that perhaps it will be a little too late if we're looking at children in Year 5 to stop that influence having taken hold. But I also want to ask the Secretary of State about providing positive male role models for young boys. I think that's a really important part of this. So will she address that in the consultation?
Yes, and indeed many members of this House are positive male role models, and there's many positive male role models, and of course we want to make sure that we do celebrate and support positive male role models, not just misogynistic online influencers, which we do need to teach children about the dangers about these people, and make sure that they are countered with people who are real role models for children.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I commend the Secretary of State for her statement today and for the wisdom that the Honourable Lady has used in relation to that. Thank you. My party, the Democratic Unionist Party, welcomes the guidance issued to let kids be kids and to prevent sexualised content being taught for under-9s. And indeed, the government rationale is similar to the rationale that I gave in this chamber when asking the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland not to change the RSE regime for Northern Ireland. Will the Secretary of State speak to your colleagues in Cabinet to ensure that the innocence of our children is protected in all regions of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and that the parents genuinely seeking to safeguard their children should be afforded respect in terms of classroom syllabus and their rights for protected, reasonably held views? Thank you so much.
thank my honourable friend for his comments. And of course, this is what makes this subject difficult, and to get that fine line right between, and to tread that fine line carefully between letting kids be kids, but also making sure that they are equipped in a world which is increasingly more complex than the world that we grew up in. And hopefully, we've sought very much to make sure that we get that balance right.
Order. Can I thank the Secretary of State and the Opposition front bench for their attendance?